Welcome to Pocket-Sized Tales. I am your host, Logan Q. If you're new here, I write and narrate most of my stories. I hope you enjoy my content. If you do, please hit the like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and hit the bell notification. You can also support the channel by purchasing merchandise from the Pocket Shop. The link is in the description, and follow me on Facebook. Thanks, everyone. And now, let's get on with the story. The Haunted Factory. Years ago, I worked as a security guard for a factory. In my short tenure there, I saw some pretty bizarre things, and I'm a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural. These encounters were mainly through the cameras. At the time, I was also taking classes at a community college. I was doing homework when I noticed something on the screen. Glancing up, I saw someone walking through the hallway of the office toward the front, where I was stationed. The weird thing was, I never saw them come through, and the other camera should have picked them up, but it didn't. They also didn't reappear on the original one. I was the only person there unless people were working overtime, which normally I was notified if there was any and provided a log of employees still on site. That night I was for sure alone. Just to confirm there was no one else there, I left my post to check the rest of the office, which, by the way, wasn't a big area. The office is separated from the rest of the factory. After checking all the rooms, I found nothing. Another time, I saw several employees on the factory floor on the camera. Again, I wasn't notified about anyone working overtime, so I went into the factory to check. When I got there, the lights weren't even on, nor were there any sounds of machines running. I came back, checked the cameras again, and the workers were gone. Sometimes I'd walk around the factory to get some exercise and stretch my legs. Whenever I did, I always felt like I was being watched. One time, I was pretty sure I heard the faint sound of someone crying out in pain. I called out to them and walked around looking for them, but I never found anyone. Another time, I heard whispers. It didn't happen too frequently, but just in case I started wearing my headphones with music on whenever I do my rounds. One day, my friend who was a longtime employee stopped by the front desk during his break, and we got to talking about it. He said over 15 years ago, there was a freak accident which resulted in an explosion killing multiple employees and injuring several others. He added ever since then, there have been strange sightings around the factory. It was the reason why the turnover rate was really bad. Only a handful of employees remained after the accident. I worked there until my contract expired and decided to go elsewhere. The company eventually went out of business a few years later, forcing the factory to close. Deeply distraught over his failed business venture, the owner took his own life by shooting himself inside his office on the second story of the building. Until this day, the factory remains abandoned. Poltergeist at work. When I was young, I worked for this huge factory. It spanned 80 acres and was several stories high. In that time, there were many accidents, some of them involving deaths and many injuries. I felt like there was something off about the place, like maybe the land was cursed. It was always unusually cold. Things would move and fall on their own, which resulted in some of the accidents and fatalities. Employees always felt like there were eyes on them. The factory was old and dingy, and none of us were brave enough to go anywhere alone. I found this out the hard way. The first time I always felt uneasy about the building, but my first paranormal experience happened when I was still a new employee. One day, while heading to the bathroom, I felt something following me, and though it was dark, there were areas where there was just enough light to see one's shadow. I was walking through a hallway when the corner of my eye caught something beside my shadow. It couldn't have been something forming it since there was nothing else there. The shadow thing took the form of a woman in a robe or dress of some sort. It had a long, massive amount of frizzy hair. At least I thought it was hair that was matted and tangled. The most terrifying thing about it was the eye. It was white or hollow where the eye was supposed to be. I couldn't understand how that was possible on a shadow. I quickly glanced behind me in case there was someone behind me. There wasn't. As soon as I realized there was no one there, I took off sprinting down the hall with the shadow being in pursuit. I was so scared I ran past the bathroom and rounded a corner, colliding into a pair of office workers like a bowling ball. We all fell onto the floor. "Help! "That thing is after me," I cried. "What thing? I don't see anything," one of the office workers replied. We all looked and saw nothing. The shadow thing was gone. They must have thought I was crazy since I was hysterically crying and screaming. Ever since that day, I never went anywhere alone again. I was lucky enough to never witness or be involved in an accident, but have seen things move or fall on their own, so I could understand how accidents can happen. I heard voices and whispers, other strange sounds, and even shadows darting around corners. Someone I knew said they've once heard snarling, and when they looked in that direction, they saw multiple sets of glowing eyes in a dark corner staring back at them. It wasn't an ideal situation working there, but they paid well at the time, and my family needed the money. I worked a few more years until the factory finally closed due to safety concerns. It never reopened, but I was able to find another job. Junkyard of the Dead. I worked for a government-operated junkyard for many years when I lived overseas, and I've seen some creepy stuff. It wasn't what you'd normally see here in the States, where people go into the salvage yards with tools for parts. I'm sure even those places could potentially be breeding grounds for hauntings too. So this place I worked at was practically a landfill for out-of-commission vehicles. The locals call it the bus graveyard, but there were other motor vehicles there as well. Surprisingly, quite a few motorbikes. Many vehicles sent there were involved in horrible and gruesome accidents resulting in fatalities, with some of the victims being totally decapitated. Some of them were hauled to us with blood and gore still stained on the seats, dashboard, and floors. It was an interesting job, but took quite a bit of getting used to. Everything was piled so closely together, creating really narrow pathways to walk through. Two people couldn't walk side by side, and would literally be next to each car as we made our way through the maze of cars, and a huge one at that. It was a huge place filled with lots of twists and turns, so it was easy to get lost. There were a few of the cars there I really tried to stay away from if I could help it. They gave me really bad vibes. It turned out I couldn't avoid them forever, as I soon found out. It was almost like those entities could sense my fear. I was poor and desperate when I was young, so I would often scavenge some of the cars for money. On average, I'd come home with the equivalent of about $3 to $4 American dollars. It was mostly coins, but they added up. There were a few times I'd get lucky and found almost $10. I even found 20 once. On occasion, I even managed to find some jewelry. On one of my searches, I was checking the bottom of the front passenger seat when the car door slammed itself against me. I yelped in pain, and Al realized the door was pinning me between the opening. After a bit of struggling, I managed to escape. When I finally got out of the car, I became discombobulated, suddenly finding myself seated in a bus at night. It was moving, but I wasn't sure where it was headed. I got up and looked around, realizing I was its only passenger. Not sure what was going on, I started to become anxious. "Where's this bus headed?" I shouted toward the front of the bus, but there was no reply. Thinking maybe the bus driver didn't hear me, I made my way closer. "Hey, driver, where is this bus headed?" I called out once again, and again there was no answer. "Stop the bus." "I need to get off," I shouted, working my way to the front. The bus slowed to a stop and the door slid open. My heart sank when I got to the front of the bus. There was no one driving it then. A passenger stepped on and my eyes widened in horror. It was a middle school girl in a school uniform. She was drenched in blood from head to toe. The right side of her face was a mangled mess. The girl was missing an eye, but she stared intensely at me with the white of her remaining one. There was a crowd behind her waiting to get on. All of them were more or less in the same condition as the girl. I swallowed hard and backed away. I was in such shock and terror, my legs failed to respond accordingly, and I fell on my rear as the ghoulish children slowly lumbered toward me with their hands outstretched, reaching for me. I tried to get away, but my legs felt like they were weighed down by cylinder blocks. Soon they were upon me, seizing me with their cold, clammy hands. I let out a blood-curdling scream and blacked out. When I came to, I was lying next to the car that tried to kill me. I jumped to my feet and ran back to the office. Glancing at my watch, I saw that only a few minutes had passed. I never knew what happened that day, but one thing was for sure. I stopped scavenging for money after that. As I continued to work there, every now and then I'd hear or see glimpses of the dead, reminding me they were always watching. My coworkers all shared the same stories, but I doubted any of them showed the spirits the lack of respect I did. In hindsight, I think I got off pretty easy. I believe what happened that day was them showing me I wasn't untouchable, and that they could get to me if they wanted.